Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to Kylin.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to start the webinar on sustainability this afternoon. We're going to wait for the slides to come up and we can share with you guys some of the basic protocols that we have for this afternoon session.
Okay, can you see the slides now?
Yes.
Perfect.
So the webinar will cover how governmental funding can support EMDT work. We just want to welcome you guys to the webinar and ensure that this is a safe space for you guys to get your questions answered. We will have time at the end to go over any questions that may come up for you guys. We also are going to go over information on slides. So if you have any questions particular to the slides, please feel free to ask those questions and put questions in the chat. I will keep my eye on the chat and make sure that those questions are answered as we continue. This webinar is being provided to you guys by the 2021 award from the Office of Victims of Crime through the Office of Justice Programs in the U.S. Department of Justice. So just some housekeeping. While the presentation is happening, we ask that you keep yourself on mute. And once we open up for questions, if you would like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself or you can raise your hand. We would like you to utilize the chat feature where you put your question in. That way we can have a little bit of order to our question and answer portion. If you need any assistance with renaming your Zoom square, please let us know. We can assist you with that. And if you need any assistance with raising your hand or asking any questions, please let us know. We can help you with that as well. This session is being recorded. So after, we would have that available to you guys along with the slides and specific information from our presenters. Today, we have Laura Ivkovich with us from the Office of Victims of Crime, Linsey Wingfield from the Colorado Department of Public and Safety. We also have Daniza, Medina, from the Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants from the District of Columbia. I'm going to pass it off to Laura for her to cover some of the information from the Office of Victims of Crime.
Okay, before that, our overview of what we're going to cover today as a group. I'm going to do a lot of the first part of it, and that is, hello, welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit about OVC, its mission and funding, the VOCA Crime Victim Assistance Program services, the new rule for victim assistance, which is no longer really new, the general parameters for government funding. I think I'm going to cover that, but so are our guests. And then key factors that funders consider when making funding decisions. We'll all talk about that as well. Next slide, please. So you all are familiar with OVC. You get our funding, so you probably know what that is. But do you know that our office is committed to ensuring the enhancement of the capacity to assist crime victims? So we do that through a lot of different ways. And our funding comes from a very unique place. And that those funds go back out to states for victim comp and assistance, training, international terrorism programs. Federal agencies get funding like the FBI and U.S. attorneys' offices are all funded by us. We have survivor of human trafficking programming. Tribal communities get funds through us. And we also fund demonstration and service projects. And as you'll see down a few slides from here, the majority of funding supports formula programs, which is why we have our VOCA administrators here who can talk to you about that aspect. Next slide. I'm going to focus on the state victim assistance formula piece because that's the part that is important, I think. But OVC does get its money, I said, from a unique place. It comes not from tax dollars. It's derived instead mostly from convicted federal offenders. And most of those are fraudsters at the federal level. That money goes into a fund that our office administers. Next slide. We do that through both compensation and assistance. And the assistance side of the house is really the victim services side, where we support direct services like counseling, shelter, advocacy, legal services, and the like. And you'll hear from the VOCA administrators that many states embark on needs assessments or otherwise determine their state's needs. But there are certain constraints with use of these funds at the state level, including a prioritization for certain types of victims like domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and the like. But there are ways to work with that. But direct services for crime victims do include services that any victim could avail themselves of, depending upon age, and not depending upon age, really. Next slide. So the traditional victim assistance services typically include crisis counseling, individual group therapy, court accompaniment, safety, housing, shelter, information and referral services, and emergency legal advocacy. Those are the traditional groups of victim assistance services. Next slide. Your grant funding for your EMDTs are discretionary or non-formula funding. I think we need the next slide if you can go there, please, Marty. There you go. So the VOCA funds that you guys have are for the non-formula side of the house. And for the National Center, we also fund them from our non-formula side of the shop. So our national scope training and technical assistance comes out of this pot. Our demonstration programs, our legal assistance programs, our program evaluation, and then certainly the programs that you're funded under, services for victims of crime. Next slide. So you'll see the majority, that green part of the slide shows the $1.8 billion that our office administered for this fiscal year, 2023 funding. The majority of that went out the door back to the states for comp and assistance. That's where the lion's share of government funding goes. We're just the administrators of it. It goes back out to the states for them to make the decisions about how they're going to fund their state and their needs in the state using these dollars. So next year, I have to say that we're not looking at a big windfall. We're looking at probably a lot less than that. I think our estimate for our discretionary fund is even shrinking even more. But you'll see the little yellow slice, that is the discretionary program pot, the pot that you get your EMDT money out of. So whatever we try and do with the little bit of money that we get, we try and be strategic about it. Next slide. So we did want to make sure, as we were running into the next century, that our victim assistance rules were updated to keep track with what was going on with regard to what victim services looked like, what the needs of victims were starting to look like. And effective in 2016, the VOCA victim assistance guidelines were updated and put out as a new rule, codified by CFR. So VOCA authorized this annual formula grant funding for victim assistance that goes out to the states. And these programs are utilizing these codified rules to determine what they can and can't do with those funds. They too have the responsibility of updating their own guidance for the state. So what I'm going to walk through is OVC's policy, and some states can go as far as we have said they should go, and some states have gone further, and some states are still waiting to change their guidelines to come up to speed as well. But that was the effort, was to update our guidelines as rules codified as rules so that it would reflect OVC's policy and the needs of the victim services field and VOCA itself. Next slide. I'm going to go ahead and give you the sense that there were a lot of things or major provisions in the rules. There were 6 major provisions. The one that I'm going to talk about is the subrecipient allowable and unallowable cost portion of what was changed. So basically you can go back one slide. Basically the subrecipient allowable and unallowable cost portion of these rules clarified that underserved victims, the requirements regarding services to underserved victims were clarified, and it continues to provide that victims of elder abuse, human trafficking, and other crimes are eligible for VOCA-funded assistance. Recall I mentioned about the 10% rule, 10% for child abuse, 10% for domestic violence, 10% for sexual assault. This rule change just reminded us that there is still this underserved category of victims, and elder abuse still remains under that other category of underserved victims. And then financial exploitation under this new rule, states can use VOCA funding for programs to address financial exploitation unless the state restricts that category. There's nothing in VOCA that says you can't use the funding for that, but states can restrict it if they wish to. Now we'll go to the next slide under legal assistance. This is also a subrecipient now allowable cost, and it clarified what legal assistance is. And it's where it's reasonable, and as a direct result of the victimization, these services can include, but are not limited to, which means it can go further, services that help victims assert their rights in criminal proceedings or protect their safety, privacy, or other interests as victims in such proceedings. Motions to vacate or expunge a conviction, for instance. This is very important. For this purpose, let's say for a victim of elder exploitation where identity theft was part of it, and a criminal, they now have a criminal warrant out for their arrest for something they didn't do, something like that. And then there's other actions where they're reasonably necessary, more of the immediate emergency type of legal assistance services. These can be shaped and looked at in terms of any type of crime victim, not just elder, but legal assistance is one thing that we do know comes into play in these kinds of cases. Next slide. Other subrecipient allowable costs under the VOCA victim assistance rule include mental health counseling and care. This always was the case, but we wanted to also mention it goes, it's not limited to, it goes beyond outpatient therapy counseling as well, but it has to be by a person who meets professional standards. So we want to make sure that the victims who are receiving services funded by VOCA are getting those needed services by professionals. Next slide. Another category of subrecipient allowable cost is forensic interviewing. This is very important to the EMDTs, as you know, and very specific to this EMDT solicitation for which you were funded. We wanted to make sure that EMDTs went beyond the traditional and went into the forensic accounting and other unique players who could come together for EMDT and address some of the financial exploitation side of those who have poly-victimization or ongoing victimization needs. So for forensic interviews, the parameters that have to be met are that it will be used not only for law enforcement and for prosecution purposes, but for identification of needs such as social services, personal advocacy, case management, substance abuse treatment, and mental health services, and that the interviews are conducted in the context of a multidisciplinary investigation and diagnostic team, or in a specialized setting. So again, this really does set the stage for your knowing that these are the kinds of services for which you can be reimbursed for your EMDT efforts. And so for your VOCA administrators who might not be reminded of that, I wanted to make sure you knew that this is where it's found in the CFR. Next slide. Also for older victims, as is with domestic violence or some of the other types of or harassment types of crimes, transitional housing is also spelled out as an allowable cost, including things as, and set by the state administrating agency representatives, transitional housing for victims who cannot safely return to their previous housing due to circumstances of their victimization, included but not limited to travel, rental assistance, security deposits, utilities, other incidental costs to the relocation, voluntary support services such as counseling, things like that. So again, this is an area where perhaps there's need for in the EMDT space where at the federal level, VOCA does allow for this. Hopefully the states will as well, or are as well. Next slide, please. And then another subrecipient allowable cost speaks directly to this. Next slide, please. Or go back one, I'm sorry, the multi-system, there we go. Allowable cost for activities supporting direct services. And this is multi-system, interagency, multidisciplinary response to crime victims' needs. So these are the activities that support a coordinated and comprehensive response. You know about that. It's included but not limited to, so it can go beyond this, salaries and expenses of direct service staff serving adult abuse, multidisciplinary investigation, and treatment teams. This is you guys. This is a case EMDT. This is you through and through. It also can work to help for those who need to participate on statewide or other task forces or work groups or committees to develop protocols, interagency, and other working agreements. Oftentimes, these are the types of things that your state commissions or state attorney general or governor's office might be working on, or that OVW, the Office on Violence Against Women, might be doing through their CCR community programs. So there is an acknowledgement that there needs to be this look at how systems are supporting a more comprehensive and coordinated approach to addressing the unique needs of victims. And I guess I skipped relocation. Let's go back one more. I apologize. I skipped that one. Relocation is also an allowable cost, and that's subject to restrictions, of course, but it's for relocation of victims, including but not limited to reasonable moving expenses, including security deposits of housing, rental expenses, and utility startups. I don't know how that translates so perfectly for victims needing to leave their home because somebody else is in it and taking it over and exploiting them. I'd rather see the exploiter leave. But in any case, I just want you to know that this is also an allowable cost under VOCA. So let's go 2 more slides ahead to get to know your state administrator, your state agency funding administrator. So since they know the new rules and they know that OVC wants there to be more and greater flexibility for them, we're hoping that states will expand services to additional crime types. We're also hoping that these state administrators are strategically determining the needs in their state, are interested in better collaboration and leveraging their funds. Some of our speakers are also working with other types of federal grant dollars to look and see how they work best in the state. So they're kind of doing the same type of thing and looking to better build services for victims of elder abuse and financial exploitation. As I've just gone down some of these slides about the new VOCA rule, they do understand that we're trying to expand and not constrict the types of services or the types of victims that they might encounter and use VOCA funding to address the needs of. So I want to turn back to Kylin and have us talk through the managers of our current VOCA funded programs and see what they can bring to help you as you're thinking about moving forward. You know that you've been doing your data. You know that you've been doing your performance reports. You know that you've been serving your victims. So you've got evidence. You've got an ability, a proven ability. You've got experience, and you've got data. So that should be an easy lift, and we're hoping that it will be. So let me turn it back to Kylene and see if there are others that can chime in or have questions to start with. So
Thank you, Laura. And as we started talking about flexibility, I want to open it up to Linsey and Daniza to kind of talk about what kind of flexibility do VOCA funders have in making awards.
Do you want to go first, Daniza, or do you want? Oh, okay. What flexibility do we have in making awards? Here in Colorado, and I think as you'll see, and I think as they noted, each state interprets the rule and applies their own funding criteria. So I think our office has taken a pretty broad approach to the VOCA rule, and we try to I think our method here in Colorado is to get to yes a lot. So I think there's not a lot that we don't typically fund. And I think we're pretty flexible in making awards. I think, as mentioned earlier, the funding is going down. So I think states are starting to feel a pinch in terms of our VOCA awards. And each state is in different progress, right, with it. For instance, some states have already started cutting their awards. Whereas here in Colorado, we're anticipating cutting our awards in the next cycle. So that's in 2025. And we're cutting them by 60%. But I think in that sense, we're still trying to be flexible in funding programs that we have in the past, but also still opening the door for new grantees to apply for us in our funding. Hopefully that answers. But
thank you, Linsey. Daniza, do you have anything you want to add?
Sorry, I but I'm back. So I'm not sure exactly what Linsey said, but to add to what we do as a territory DC, pretty much we do have some flexibility. You know, we do have limited dollars and we try to spend them as wide as we can. However, when we do one solicitation at a certain time of the year, if we expend all of those dollars, we do stay on top of monitoring spending patterns to see what we can throw back in the pot and maybe release a second solicitation and pretty much encourage folks to apply to that. Also, what a lot of folks don't know is that we do accept unsolicited proposals. We cannot guarantee that we will fund them, but if you miss one window of opportunity, definitely, something's evolving. Maybe your program needs to grow. You're noticing with the data that you're collecting that you're getting more of a certain demographic. You can, submit a unsolicited proposal. Pretty much, it's a budget, it's a work plan, it's goals and objectives, and we do hold on to those until after we make awards with our solicited proposal, and we might be able to start you off maybe in the last quarter of a fiscal year. And then that, you can kind of really gauge, the progress of that program. If it's something new, it's a great opportunity to introduce to us something new and maybe start you off with at least 3 months, where then later on, when we open our solicitation for a 12-month period, you'll be kind of already in the door with that.
Thank you. Both you and Laura mentioned data collection as a way that programs could support or stand out when they're applying for funding. But what kind of pre-planning should grantees engage in when considering submitting an application?
I'll go first. So pre-planning, great question. We do have, of course, the data collection, getting your information together, knowing what your budget's going to look like. I think it's really helpful when we see more than a 1-year budget, even though we only fund a 12-month period at a time. we would welcome a 3-year plan, at least so we know that there's some sustainability talking happening and you really are, putting everything you have into this program. We want to see if you've had other funding from other sources that we can maybe, add to that. So not just solely depending on what we provide. And then if we can't provide for another year, the program doesn't last. We want to see that you have some connections. We want to see that you are working in partnership with other community service providers. We do require in our RFA that you submit 3 letters of support, MOUs. That's definitely a requirement that we score you on. So we definitely want to make sure that you're making those connections. Any type of, meetings that we have, we have the Victim Assistance Network, and anybody can join that pretty much. You don't have to necessarily be receiving funding from our office. You just need to be a service provider. So that's a great opportunity to network and collaborate with other established organizations. Also, we do our pre-bidders conference. So whenever we release a solicitation, we give that orientation on what the expectations are. And then we also, we started this maybe like 3 years ago. We hired a consultant to work with organizations that were thinking about seeking funding from our office and helping them with grant writing. So those opportunities are really good for folks to, connect with or be involved with in order to know what is it that a funder's looking for when they release a solicitation. How does the scoring process work? What are resources that they can collect data from? One of the common things that we see is that folks will report data that's nationwide, but we want to know what's happening in DC. So kind of scale it down to the local area which you will be providing services.
Linsey, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh my gosh, I feel like Daniza totally took that and said everything I was going to say, but I would definitely echo the data point. National data is great, but doing local or state data and also relevant data. I think in applications, I typically see data being used from 5 years ago, and that's not very relevant when, you could have used data from last year. Something we really try to hone in on, and so just to kind of point out a difference, right, between DC and Colorado, right? Like for our applications, we don't require letters of support or MOUs. So I think definitely attending any pre-application workshops or bidder conferences, getting in touch with your VOCA administrator is key, and kind of getting information on when those are, because that's usually when us as an office, and I think many states do this. I'd be shocked if there were some that didn't, but we always have a conference before, some type of training, outlining what's expected in the application, how we're going to review it, what's going to be scored, the available funding. So I think it's definitely key to attend those. And if you can't attend, reach out and ask for information, just be engaged. Something we try to encourage our current subrecipients too, and it sounds like you all have some form of this, is if you have any metrics that you're tracking as you go along with your program, especially if you had a goal of increasing the number of clients you're seeing or reaching into certain communities over a certain grant period, write that in your application. I think what we like to see is kind of a demonstrated impact, at least in Colorado, and how your services are working. You have metrics, you have a way of measuring that. Other than that, I don't think I have anything else to add that wouldn't be what Daniza had already said, but she did a phenomenal job. So
Thank you both. As both responses really covered a full scope of what, we're looking for. And so, kind of talking about programs that you guys already kind of have earmarked and programs that you're already supporting, but wanting to still have that yes for new programming. What do states do that have set programs for their VOCA funding, but they, want to find funding for new programs? And I guess I'll point that question to you first, Linsey, and then we'll have it be supported. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think as I'm going to keep saying, every state is different. We have had programs here in Colorado that we have funded for 20+ years, and then we've had some that we've only been funding for a year. I think especially with talks about federal funding decreasing so significantly in our next cycle, there's a lot of internal conversations with our staff and our funding board of how do we still support new programs, because we understand a goal here in Colorado is to increase services to underserved and underrepresented communities. And our definition here is very broad, so that can encompass anyone and everything. So how do we open the doors to bring those programs with innovative services that are providing, maybe not the traditional victim services in these times? So I think we're looking at setting aside a percentage of our funding. So, VOCA has the 10% requirement for DV, sexual assault, SA, and has a 10% underserved, which each state can define. But we would probably also set aside another 5% or some type of money that's earmarked specifically for brand new programs. So I think it is, I've heard of other states that just don't have the ability to do that. But again, that's where it's important to be involved with the office that administers the VOCA funds, attend any conferences or trainings that they have that are available to the public. So.
In DC, we work a little differently. So, it really comes down to how much money we receive. And with the VOCA assistance dollars, it's just not enough. So we came to the conclusion a few years ago that we would just do a combined or consolidated solicitation. And folks are able to apply and select a funding source. However, we can always select the funding source for them based on how much money we have and how we manage the formula. We are always looking to make sure that we satisfy all pockets of victimization, pretty much. Underserved is highly noted, and we live in the district which there's a lot of underserved categories. So it definitely, we're always looking for that. We're making sure that representation is across the city. So with the VOCA dollars, because we are limited a little bit with the percentage, well, not really limited, but we have to meet the minimum. We do that easily within the district. We do rely a lot on our local funding to manage the rest. So that's why we do the consolidated RFA, because we know that we don't have enough of the federal dollars to meet all of the needs. So really, you just pretty much to go back to what I said earlier about the unsolicited proposals, that's a great opportunity to really, get that noticed if we miss that opportunity during this open solicitation period. So I really do encourage folks to do that. It's like I said, it's kind of like one of those like unspoken secrets, but we do accept them, and there's no guarantee, but also really just making those partnerships is really critical, because we're looking for strong service providers. We want to make sure that they administratively can handle all of the requirements that come with federal funding. And that seems to be a challenge with a lot of small service providers. Another thing that we had done, this is our first year actually, we are working on capacity building. So we did have an application process, and those smaller organizations have applied, and pretty much the capacity building really goes across the board. It can help with financial management, creating a board, any administrative assistance that folks might need. It's a small amount of money, but we did run the program for, it's a year, so we're coming toward the end of the year, and it's being really, actually, we're seeing success with it. It was very limited to, I think we had 10 participants. So 10 organizations, that's 10 organizations that we had never funded, that just kept getting the applications denied, and now maybe next year they'll qualify and receive some VOCA dollars, and we would feel more confident in giving it to them, knowing that they can sustain and meet the requirements.
Thank you. And I know you're talking about qualifications. I know some things that we talked about earlier or, what are the grant parameters that can support EMDT work? And speaking from OVC or VOCA or VAWA funding, what are some of those parameters that grantees can think about? And I guess I'll pass that question off to Linsey first, and then we'll hear back from Daniza.
Yeah, I guess, what parameters can support? So I guess, sorry, I think this is that one of those questions I was a little kind of confused at parameters, like, in terms of like funding or like what programs are asking for, or
Funding and what programs are asking for. So in general, we talked about some different parameters. We talked about formula. We also talked about qualifications and things of that nature. Anything to add to those particular areas or any additional areas people can think about when talking about parameters?
Yeah, so definitely, like taking a look at the funding and the source, but also taking a look at like solicitations. So I think Daniza mentioned a consolidated process. Our state also does a consolidated process. However, we do it in a way where you apply to a specific source, but we on the back end have the discretion of moving you wherever we see you fit. So I think there's also those, because, there are certain things when, especially in EMDT and MDT work, that while some of it may be allowable under VOCA, other things like training other professionals is not really an allowable activity, but under VAWA, which our office administers, it would be. So as we're looking on our end, that's something we're taking into account when reviewing applications. Instead of automatically writing you off for one grant, if we have funding over here still, and it's an allowable activity, so splitting things up in that sense. So I think kind of just taking into account, the allowable activities of each grant and kind of what you're requesting. Typically, some states, we don't, but I know I used to work in Massachusetts in a previous life, also with VOCA. And at one point, they used to have a list on their website of allowable and unallowable costs. So I think, like, again, I know I keep saying it and I'm just going at it, but just kind of research the office that administers VOCA, because sometimes they will have resources for current grantees on there that could really help inform what you can or can't apply for or request for allowable costs. Again, Colorado doesn't really do that. We have an internal list we use, but yeah, I think that's also other things that you can kind of look at and to support your work.
Denise, anything to add? Okay, so just to wrap up the Q&A portion for the panelists, what are key factors that you look for when considering a program for funding? And we'll start off with Daniza.
So key factors, we want to make sure, and we do include this in our solicitation, that your program is trauma informed. We also look for collaborations. Like I said, the LOIs and the MOUs are requirements. We look for sustainability. We want to know that you are working toward other funding resources and that there's a plan beyond the 12-month period that we fund your program. And I pretty much, those are the top.
Thank you, Daniza. Linsey, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so here in Colorado, we actually have a board that reviews and approves all the applications. And so they come up with a funding philosophy and a review criteria, which we put in our announcement. So that's going to be the first line of looking at, does it, one, meet the philosophy of our funding board, and does it hit on the criteria as they're reviewing? So it kind of just outlines what they're looking for. I think also the big thing is it eligible, right? So I think we're looking at basic eligibility requirements here of not charging victims for services. If you are applying for victim assistance, do you help with victim compensation? Are you aware of that? If not, like that's going to be a requirement post-award. And kind of, just making sure when you're applying, not supplanting funds. So if you're already getting state funding for a position, or, no, I'm saying it wrong. Anyway, not supplanting when you're requesting funds. So we usually see that a lot with our DA's offices in our law enforcement, very rarely with nonprofits. But I also think, like, on top of that, in terms of application, our state has really moved away from trying to score on quality of writing, rather a demonstrated need. Again, I mentioned, we kind of ask programs to use their demonstrated need from their current grant to write their next applications. But also, especially if a program is doing well, like the need for more money. I think especially now as we're going into a cycle with decreased funding, what is, if it seems like you have a really robust budget, like a agency budget, do you anticipate a loss of funding? What would that do for services? So I think highlighting that is also what we look for in an application. Just to simply ask for more money, sometimes for us, is often a reason not to deny, but not to fund fully, because justification wasn't made for all of this, much more money, and less of the money was needed to serve more victims. And you need that because you have this data to support the evidence, or you're going to get a funding cut coming up. So there's a lot I mean that we look at, but I think, yeah.
I'll chime in and just say, from the federal level, as you guys know, since you're grant funded, we looked at a lot of things. Sometimes we note it in the solicitation itself, like geographic diversity. Even if everybody came in that could all be funded, we might be looking to place funding where it needs to be. And that often is the basis as described by the applicant themselves as to where that geographic need is. Strategic priority. Sometimes the state has listed some sort of a state priority. If it can be tied to that mission or goals of the agency for which you're seeking funding, that helps too. Or priority areas. This administration, equity and access. Prior administrations, rural and poverty zones. High crime rate, not high crime rate. Those kinds of priority areas can wax and wane depending upon whoever's making the policy side of the decisions. Whether there's available funding or not. For us, if it's discretionary, that we have a lot more latitude with. But if it is appropriated and it's spelled out by statute what's going to be funded, that's a whole different thing. Past performance, showing that there are no high risks, that your performance reports and financials have been all sent in on time, and there's no high risk. Supporting the data, we've all talked about that, letters of support, MOUs, past successful effort. And then we use a peer review process. It sounds like Colorado does a board similar. We generally score those above a 70, but not always. Anybody above a 70 is typically, we send that to a decision maker, usually our director, with rationale. If we need to pluck somebody else out because of geographic diversity or some other benefit to the whole program at large, we have to justify that ourselves as well. So the states likely do a little bit of that too, because you usually have more applications than you have funding to provide. So a lot of those are the factors when making the funding decisions for us. And I think at our other federal agencies as well, like OVW.
Thank you, Laura. And as we're opening it up to our audience to ask questions, we had one come in through the chat. Is it okay to ask for the same amount of money to continue our good work, or is it better to ask for more in order to grow? And so I will pose that question to Linsey, and then we can hear from Daniza and then Laura.
I think in the past, when VOCA was flush, we would want to encourage to grow services if needed. If you're a brand new program and it's justified in your application, I think moving forward, definitely take a look at the funding announcement from your particular funder, because here in Colorado, I don't think our priority is to expand services with this next funding cycle, rather to just maintain, because we are going to experience a large cut. So I think but I don't think that would preclude us from funding expansions if they are justified. So again, I think it's just if the cost is justified and supported by your statement of work or whatever application narrative you provide, I think it could be justified if you need it.
Thank you, Linsey.
Yeah, I agree. We always advise applicants to request exactly what they need. And so with what they need is money, more money to expand within that award period, then request it. It definitely has to meet your goals and objectives, you know, the other expenses that you have, everything has to tie together. So it definitely has to make sense, just like Linsey said. So we don't discourage folks asking for more. From year to year, we just can't guarantee that we would fund it, but we want to see what we're looking at.
At the federal level, we usually describe in the solicitation the amount that is a maximum. So up to is usually the language, the magic language that we use. You'll be surprised how many people come in below the up to amount. So if there's an up to amount, I would use it, try to use it if possible. We also strategically try and fund for 3 years. Year 1, knowing it's a planning year. Year 2, more of an implementation year. And year 2 and 3 being more of a understanding what your growth is, what your policies are, what your outreach is, and then your evaluation of your services, your satisfaction surveys, things like that, that will help grow your program, but also hone in where you need to do the best service possible. And trauma informed is another thing that you had mentioned was good to include. So at the federal level, we describe what it is we're going to fund. We rarely get fund requests for more than what we're said we would fund, but that is what is approved by the funders, and that's what we have to stick to at the federal level.
Thank you, Laura. Are there any other questions from the audience? Any other questions from any of the TA providers? Anything that may be coming up for grantees that were unable to meet with us today?
While you're waiting to hear that, or people are putting stuff into the chat, I'll say that like the states, the federal government does have a place where you can look for future grants by typing in the keyword index, elder abuse, MDTs, things like that. There are also community funders that do a similar thing. There are foundations, boards that, you know, that they put that out there in advance, what they're looking to fund. So putting all your eggs in one funder basket is never a great idea. I'll just say that right there. And being strategic, having a logic model, which we required, knowing what a logic model really is used for, and then trying to use that in identifying your funding would be another strategic way to look at that. So, but there's the the grants.gov. And that has a keyword index that will notify you when something's going to be coming up. We also do things in advance of the actual solicitation date. We will pre-plan and put that out on the DOJ website for funding, that we're planning on funding. And all that's dependent upon appropriations and anything else that might get in our way. But that's what we're planning to do. And if you look at those, you'll see it's not just OVC that does that. OVW does it, COPS, NIJ, if you're looking to do some part of a research piece of this. So there's others that you could fill in the word elder justice or elder or MDT and see what pops up. Potentially, there are elements of what you're doing that could be funded from other places, but we don't want you to supplant using funds, federal funds with what is already funded at the state or local level. I think as Linsey mentioned before.
Thank you, Laura. Are there any questions? I'm gonna take the time to thank our panelists for being here today, for answering, the questions that were on the minds of our grantees as they're moving into sustainability for our grantees, our 2021 grantees, and for our 2019 grantees who are working on sustaining their programs and moving forward. So I want to thank you guys on their behalf and say thank you for your time and being able to really lay it out for us as to what is needed, what is looked for, and how they can improve on applying for different funding moving forward. Thank you. Is there anything else you want to add, Marty, before we end today's session?
No, thank you very much for coming. Good food for thought. And I know in my grant life, cobbling funds together was the best way to make sure that you were able to meet the needs of everyone so thank you for making that point, Laura. Definitely. And Linsey, the fact that you administer different pots of federal funds, and I think Daniza, you said you did that too, but that if you're not able to fund it, you look at how else it can be funded. That's so important. And I was really excited to hear that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll send out the PowerPoint as well as some additional information from our presenters. And we also will send out the survey for this webinar. So we look forward to hearing from you, and we also look forward to sending you that information. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
So Marty, is there anything else you need from us, or?
No, I'm going to send out your solicitations and let them so they can get a feel for what it looks like. Thank you so much for sending those in. And also, I thank you guys so much for your flexibility as things changed with this webinar. I just think you guys are fabulous.
Thank you. Thanks for having
me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, we really appreciate
Great
it.
information.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I hope the grantees take it to heart and really make use of it. Come on,
Sounds good.
come on.
If anything, they can just